Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, where we will provide essential information for pre-medical students and those already in medical school. Listen each week for tips on how to improve your application and gain an acceptance to medical school.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast. Dr. Marinelli here. Today, I have Dr. Ed Lipsit on the line. He is one of our master advisors. You've heard from him before, and he has just a wealth of experience in medical school admissions as a former admissions committee member at Virginia Commonwealth. And he also just works with tons of applicants each year for years and years, just helping them through the application process. Hi, Dr. Lipsit. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Renee. Great to hear from you.
Well, today we wanted to talk a little bit about secondaries, and I know everybody's kind of in the midst of turning around secondaries, and their inboxes are just getting flooded with requests for secondaries. So I thought it would be a good idea to talk a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of them. And so, Dr. Lipsit, what I'd like to start talking about today is how do admissions committees view secondary applications and kind of the entire evaluation of an applicant?
Well, the secondary is really a very, very important part of the application. I'll explain why. Obviously, applicants are familiar with the primary, and the primary is filled with information about them that the committee wants to see, of course. But the primary application is still fairly generic. And the secondary is an opportunity for each committee, each school, to ask questions that tend to be far more school-specific. Mm-hmm. And it's an opportunity for the applicant to convince a committee that you specifically chose that school and gave it careful consideration. You weren't just casting a wide net, but there was a reason why you're applying to that school. So it is an opportunity also to include information that perhaps you couldn't include on the primary, such as future plans, or maybe there are some recent accomplishments that may have occurred after submitting your primary that you'd like the committee to know about. So this really does paint a broader picture of the applicant. And I know that when I was doing file reviews, I thought that the secondaries were extremely important.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think building on that is giving that admissions committee a little taste of your uniqueness outside of the AMCAS application, like you said, which is just so generic. I mean, there's a couple secondaries. I can name USC as one, which their specific essay questions are really all about like the individual. And one of them is, if you had to pick a nickname for yourself, what would it be and why? I mean, it doesn't really seem applicable to medicine, but it's really just trying to showcase that applicant's personality and who they are. So I totally agree with you, Dr. Lipsit. It's definitely gives a more personal aspect to that applicant, and then also really a specific direction of why this person is actually applying there rather than it just being a medical school that they listed on their application.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that particular prompt or question, the nickname, because that sticks out in my mind. That I thought it was a fascinating thing to ask. And interestingly, in working with applicants who are presented with that, usually the response tells me a lot about the individual. It really does.
It really does to me too. Yeah. And it really reads to their creativity,
absolutely,
kind of ability to think outside the box. If someone puts on there like my nickname would be healer, well, that's kind of like, well, that seems typical. But if somebody puts on there like my nickname is ninja, well, then you're like really interested and want to read more about this applicant, and they bring a sense of uniqueness to their application.
Sure.
One question I get pretty frequently is, how great do these essays have to be? Because they're getting just maybe 10 in a week or even more sometimes. And I know a lot of applicants have trouble just turning them around. How great do you feel these essays have to be? Do they need to be a masterpiece like the personal statement, or can they just be good?
Well, that's a tough one to answer. My feeling is that they really should be excellent. I mean, I would hold them to the same standard as anything else that you put in an application, such as the personal statement. And that brings up the problem of, well, how do you handle the large numbers of secondaries that you get? And I think you have to be disciplined as they come in. You can't let them pile up. I think applicants rather run into trouble when they've been through a long, arduous process. They're very pleased with themselves, and they should be, that they completed the primary, got it in a timely fashion. And now here they're being inundated with the secondaries. But I think that if they are disciplined in terms of, as they receive them, attending to them promptly, that'll work out okay for them. And just one other point, we had spoken about this earlier, and that is, an applicant shouldn't be discouraged in that they may get 5 or 10 secondaries, and they require a fair amount of time and thought and effort. But then they will find, maybe after the first half dozen, things get a little easier, because many of the schools, there are common questions that are asked. And sometimes it does make them nervous to use the same response for several different schools. But the fact is, if it is a good response, a really good response, and if it really does answer the prompt, then it's good. And they maybe can modify it a little bit or customize it for the individual school. But the bulk of the question has already been answered. And so they will find that, again, after the first 5 or 10 secondaries, it's not quite as onerous.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was kind of leading into my next question is, can they recycle essays, so to speak? Can they just modify an essay that they have for one school and turn it into another one?
Again, I think they can, as long as it's extraordinarily good, well written, and it answers the question. And I've seen nothing that any of the schools have published or presented that indicate that they cannot repeat an answer as long as it's appropriate. Again, I think it's perfectly reasonable to freshen it a bit or customize it a bit. Yeah. But the basic content, I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, and I totally agree too, especially with my experience editing secondaries. I totally agree that some prompts are just going to work for other ones. Sure. And so you can reuse them. My biggest advice would be, like you said, to make sure that you have some school specifics in there, especially like the ones that are, why do you want to go to this school? Well, maybe the foundation of that can be recycled, but you need to make it specific to that school. And the other thing too that I kind of see often is make sure that your response answers the prompt. The question may be similar, but there just may be a little bit of some nuances that are slightly different in each prompt, and you should make sure that your answer addresses that prompt specifically. So just, I hate to say it, but don't get lazy. Just make sure that you can recycle them, but modifying them where it's appropriate.
Well, what I found is, well, first of all, sometimes an applicant will have a response to a question, and it's just a terrific essay. And they really, really, really want to incorporate that essay into the secondary, but it doesn't correspond to the prompt. So that is right. That you have to be concerned about. Another thing that I've seen is when they ask the question, why do you want to come to this particular institution? Why do you want to come to this school? They tend to answer the question as, why do you want to be a doctor? And that's not the same question. And being specific, in other words, you have to show that you've done your homework. There may be aspects of the curriculum at that institution that you want to integrate into your response. Resources that are available at that institution, special programs, affiliations, even the location. There may be aspects of the geography and the location that you feel suit you. Anything that you can do to add to your response, making it as school-specific as possible, convinces the committee that they just weren't a name on a long list.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And you can definitely, when you're reading through secondaries, you can definitely see who did their homework and really research what this school has to offer, and who just kind of wrote a generic answer, or maybe just, briefly browsed over their website. And if I can see that, then the admissions committee member can read that too. So I think that's a great point, and definitely trying to make sure you're putting in that effort when you're answering each question. And I think that kind of segues Dr. Lipsit into maybe a quick discussion on how to answer some of these common questions. So we touched on how to answer, why do you want to come to the school? One of the other questions that is pretty commonly asked, and I know you have even written a blog about this, which I loved your blog, is how do you answer these questions about what diversity will you contribute to the student body?
Sure. Well, I see it as two sides to a coin, actually. Sometimes you can talk about your ability to embrace diversity, and you illustrate that through some of your experiences, where maybe you've worked intimately with different populations of individuals. Diversity can be on so many different levels. It could be heritage, it could be language, it could be socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, the color of your skin. These are all the unique features that make us different. And so you can demonstrate through your experiences and activities that you've dealt with people who are different from you, and yet you've had no problem with it. They've loved you. In fact, sometimes you can talk about experiences where you thrived in those environments.
Yeah.
And so even though everybody says that they're comfortable with diversity, the fact of the matter is many people find that diversity can be off-putting. But if you can show that you can embrace diversity, that's great. And the flip side of the coin is the diversity that you contribute. In other words, things about yourself that you consider special or unique. It can be a talent, it can be a skill, or it could be your own heritage, or things that enrich the incoming class and make the class more diverse. But I've found in general that just saying it isn't good enough. You have to illustrate, you have to demonstrate that you are comfortable with diversity, and there's no better way than talking about your own individual experiences.
Yeah, and that is such a great point. And I think, as you mentioned, most people are probably thinking when they see diversity, like, oh, I'm not ethnically diverse, I didn't grow up in another country, or things like that. But diversity extends so much further from that. And I think usually the best essays on diversity are more reflections on their experiences and like those unique talents or abilities to that specific person. I think those make the best essays, making an ordinary person seem extraordinary through their experiences.
Sure.
What about another common one is describe a challenge that you've overcome? And I feel like when I read these, the knee-jerk reaction is to talk about like the MCAT or a difficult course. And
Bad idea. Bad idea.
yeah. And some schools even go to the degree of trying to deter applicants from writing about that. They'll even say that is non-academic in nature. So how do you suggest somebody go about answering that question?
Well, I think the more candid an individual is and the more personal the response, the more it will be appreciated. And it may be something that ordinarily you might not like talking about. But the fact that you're willing to talk about, let's say, a challenge or a person, sometimes they'll phrase it in this way. They'll say, talk to us about disappointment and how you overcame the disappointment.
Yeah.
And again, and as you correctly stated, my greatest disappointment was that I got a C in organic chemistry, that doesn't really have much texture, and it doesn't show you as being a person who really wants to reveal much about themselves.
Right.
But if you're willing, maybe it's a time when you let down a family member, you let down a friend, or you disappointed yourself. Or maybe it's an aspect of your personality that you weren't crazy about, but you overcame it. As a general statement, the more personal you make it and the more candid, I think the more appreciated it will be, rather than something that's relatively superficial or trivial or indicates that you're just not willing to actually confide in the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I totally agree with that too. And I think this also takes a little bit of like introspection and reflection on what was challenging. Some people don't have like these major monumental challenges in their life where, they had to work or they had to drop out of college or things like that, where they're like significant life-changing challenges. But everybody has gone through a challenge of some sort of another, personal conflict with a family member, a friend, as you mentioned. So I think it takes a little bit of creativity to kind of come up with that and make sure that you reflect on how it's really changed you as a person.
Exactly.
we'll wrap up here, Dr. Lipsit, but one final question I have for you. And you mentioned, trying to make these essays personal. And we talked about adding creativity in there and really exemplifying each person's uniqueness. Is there anything in a secondary application you think that somebody just shouldn't talk about?
That is a good question. Yeah, sometimes I deal with many applicants who are extremely honest and earnest people. However, you don't necessarily have to volunteer information about yourself that might be somewhat negative. Now, of course, we're honest. Of course, we're ethical. And if you're asked something, of course, you must give an honest response. But volunteering information or putting yourself in a negative light, strangely enough, sometimes I find people doing that. And I say to them, you're being very, very hard on yourself. And B, that's not what the question was. You don't really have to volunteer that. Maybe if you wanted to do that at the level of a personal interview, perhaps, but not in terms of the secondary unless you're specifically asked that. Another thing that is important for you not to do is to simply repeat yourself. And many times in the prompt, it'll specifically say, if you've mentioned this in your primary, please, we've read it, we've heard it, and you don't need to repeat it. Yet I do find that on occasion applicants do that because they're concerned that their word count isn't high enough, or perhaps it was an optional question and they felt the need to answer it. And of course, it's always a good idea to answer an optional question, but only if you have content. And if they say, please don't, you're kind of wasting the committee's time to some extent. So basically, stick to the prompt and answer the question.
Yeah, and that's such a great point too. And even just to go off of that, I see so many people that maybe the question is 500 words max, and maybe they wrote like a 150-word essay that really answered the prompt, but they feel like, oh, I have all this extra room. Let me go and just fill it up. Well, if you're just putting redundancy in there or repeated information, don't do that. Answer the prompt and leave it at that. If it's not the whole character space, that's okay. You don't have to fill up every tiny space that they let you have. Just answer the prompt, be concise, and make sure, like you said, you're following the directions. Right. And I think those are the best written essays.
Yeah, I always felt that when I read a secondary and it was concise and to the point and without a lot of verbosity or redundancy, I almost felt that the applicant was respecting my time.
Yeah.
And I just came away with a better feeling about the applicant. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yep, I totally agree. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lipsit. Definitely appreciate you being on today, and hopefully you can join us for more podcasts in the future.
I'd be delighted. It's my pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Listen to our podcast next week as well.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey.